They are provided by my very gracious hosts. I also want to thank for inviting me here today as the director of the Institute of Criminology at the University of Cambridge, which has been teaching police and prison officials in programs designed to support professional work for 53 years. And since 1995, we have been offering special part-time master's degrees in the applied criminology for police management and in the applied criminology for penology and correctional management. My talk today helps to summarize much of what has been learned in 53 years of work, not only at Cambridge University, but in many other universities that have chosen to use criminology not just to criticize government and to complain about government, but to help construct better government and to put knowledge to work for a safer society. Much of what I say today has been written and published in Spanish by the IDB in this protocol for evidence-based crime prevention called Developing and Evaluating Citizen Security Programs in Latin America. And one of the things I've tried to do in working with the IDB for 2 years now is to make a much closer connection between the impact studies that we can produce together in partnership between scientists and criminal justice professionals, but also to see how these impact studies can be used to actually manage and deliver operations, day-to-day work of your agencies in a more effective way. And this idea of a protocol for using evidence, not just to say what works, but to then put it to work, to apply the evidence to the work of these agencies, can be summarized in English in the concept of a triple T against crime. The triple T in English is about targeting, tracking, and testing, all of which can contribute to evidence-based security for our cities. In Spanish, you could try to stick with the T's and call it target, trazar, test, sort of English-Spanish or Spanglish or something like that. But I actually looked at this in Google Translate and thought maybe we should switch to E, because what it's really about is closer to escoger, escuchar, and examinar. How we put these together, not just one by one, but all together, all at the same time, every day, is really the challenge for putting knowledge to work against crime and for public safety. Escoger, escuchar, examinar. What does this mean? Well, for one thing, it means thinking slowly. Policing has been described by the Supreme Court of the United States as split-second decisions. No time to think. Must make a decision right away. Well, sometimes, yes. But not all the time. And if we can do what Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, suggests about trying to think more slowly about how we make quick decisions, creating a framework for better, quick decisions, we can think slowly about whether we have the right targets or focus, whether we have selected the problems, people, places, crime victims that are most important. And then when we try to work with them, are we putting our resources where we want them to be? Do we have a close match between the target and the arrow? Is the arrow hitting the target, or is it arrowing all over the community with less than perfect correspondence? And finally, what about the arrows themselves? Is the arrow we're using the right arrow? Is the policy or the practice for dealing with that crime problem the most cost-effective, in the best interest of the taxpayer and the people in our democracy? These three things coming together help us not only to decide what works, but to do what works, and to make the performance of agencies cost-effective as well as effective. Much of this focus has been demonstrated in the past 20 years by the research on concentrations of crime, what economists call the power curve. Just as the wealth of nations is often concentrated in the hands of a few people, so too is the evil of nations often concentrated in the hands of a small proportion of offenders. And the suffering of nations is concentrated among a small population of victims. So just as 17% of offenders produce over half of all arrests, 3% of the street locations, of the places in any city, yield over 50% of the police calls. And 1% of the police officers yield the most complaints. And when crime goes down in places that have been studied, like Seattle, Washington, it goes down not uniformly across the whole city, but just in a selected portion. All of the crime drop in Seattle took place at 15% of the street addresses. 85% of the city remained unchanged. So if we try to patrol 85% of the city, that's not going to change anyway. We may be wasting our resources. Can we then agree as a democracy to concentrate our resources where the crime is and to reduce any investment where there is no crime? This is the map of violent crime in the city of Tokyo. What you see is a series of big, hot, red volcanoes. These are places where many people are concentrated, largely as railroad stations or underground stations. And with those concentrations of people come these huge concentrations of violent crime. But historically, we have not used three-dimensional maps. Historically, the Japanese police, the New York police, where I began working 40 years ago, the London police, you name it, city. When you put a map out, you say, we need somebody here, somebody there, somebody everywhere. If you look at this map, you get a different impression. You say, most of this city, we don't need any police. We might have to answer some calls, but maybe those calls are not so important as preventing those violent crimes, as making sure that nobody gets shot or stabbed or raped or seriously harmed in these hotspots of crime. So this is what we mean by targeting, or escoger. We have to select where to invest our scarce resources in a much more focused way. These targeting of places of offenders, of victims, of gangs, and even specific crime types are all part of what you might say is the focusing of resources as the first step in targeting. A second step would be to classify these different kinds of targets and to indicate where the concentrations are predictable and what causes those concentrations to occur. In fact, problem-oriented policing is about identifying those causes and trying to take them away, trying to pull the legs out from the table of this concentration of crime so that it will bring it back down to this lower level of crime and stop the concentration. But even when we know where the concentrations are, we can set priorities for the greatest impact, in part because we know what works, in part because we have the best chance of success, in part because we already know what to do, and that raises the question of the second part, escuchar, tracking. Are we doing what we should be doing if we have decided what to do? We should keep looking every day, every week, every month at where crime is occurring, when crime is occurring, what days of the week, what times of day, which victims, which offenders. And then, knowing that, ask whether our security is distributed in the same way. Do we have the police resources with the places and times and with the right resources for when crime is occurring? Do we have correctional resources supervising the most dangerous offenders, the offenders who can do the most harm? And do we systematically look at the match between crime and security? And what is the ratio? How much of the security, what percentage of the security is allocated to what percentage of the crime? If we look at this ratio in programs like the Chilean project on stats that is underway, if we look at it in New York City as CompStat, we will get a very precise view. Yet so far, this is more of a university idea, or as one Cambridge scholar once said, in a way the universities can invent the future. In part because we can sit back and look and think and say, well, we know where the crime is, we know where the security is, how do we calculate the match? How do we manage to get that match to be as close as possible? Escuchar. Which then allows us to ask whether what we are doing in targeting these high priority targets, whether we are doing the best thing. And we find that out by the scientific method of conducting experiments. We can compare in any experiment between doing this or doing that. Then we can ask, if we do this, does it work better than that? And separate question, if we do this, does it cost less per crime prevented than doing that? Which one gets the best result for the same cost, for the same peso, for the same dollar? This process is something I laid out 15 years ago in my lecture on evidence-based policing, which described the cycle of evidence in policing, just as you can in corrections, by going to the literature. Universities not only create knowledge, they also preserve knowledge, and they allow us to access, now on the internet, easier than ever before. And there are many resources in the publication from the IDB, which is free to you on the web if you download the PDF file. So you can go to the literature. What does the research in Buenos Aires show? What does the research in Bogota show? You can find out these studies in Latin America as well as in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Australia. If you're working on a problem, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Somebody else has already discovered a wheel, and if you know about that from reading, you can save yourself a lot of effort in what you do right here in Cordoba, or what any city police can do by reading first, then deciding not only based on reading, but also your local data, your local escuchar, what you know about where and when crime is occurring. If you put the two together, you can agree on a program that has guidelines, that says this is what should happen, when, who should do it. This is the logic model of the program. And it is supposed to produce actions, outputs, the things that police should do, not just arrest, but the number of minutes of patrol in each high crime hotspot. And the technology to do that with GPS is now being worn by police from India to Australia to England, California, and I predict that within 5 to 10 years, you will see this as normal, that we know where each police officer is every minute. That's good for safety for the police. It's also good for public safety to try to match where the police are in relation to the predictable places where crime will occur at predictable times. And if we produce these outputs, we can make the outcomes, the crimes that occur in the city, less frequent, more favorable for public safety. And if that doesn't happen, as our in-house data would reflect, then we can ask, why not? Are we doing what we're supposed to according to the research? And if we aren't, how do we manage better? If we are doing what we should be doing and it still doesn't work, then now we have to reinvent the wheel. Now we have to try to do something different. And cities are different. This is quite likely to occur. You can't just take a program from the library shelf and put it to work without modification. So the process of using your own experience locally with globalized ideas, global strategies, global programs is one that should never stop. In management, they call it continuous quality improvement. And if we take that as the starting point, rather than thinking as the criminal law does, with all due respect to criminal lawyers, the criminal law is carved in stone. And once it's there, it doesn't change, very little certainly for hundreds of years. The management of human behavior is carved in water, and it's constantly changing. And we have to keep up with the change. The new technology, the new culture, the new music and clothing. One of the big issues in the United Kingdom was people wearing hoods over their head so they can disguise themselves from CCTV cameras. And in fact, the English Parliament almost passed a law against wearing hoods over your heads in public places. Well, in France they did that too, but for religious issues. The world keeps changing, and this process is about change. It's about using the facts to produce the best results this year, this week, not just the same way we did it 2 years ago or 5 years ago. Now, the same thing can go on in corrections. It's all about follow-up. If we care about the results, we must focus much more on what happens after prison, or after probation, or after parole. Which programs produce the least crime? Which prisons have the lowest rate of repeat offending? Do we evaluate prisons, or probation, or parole by their success rates? Or do we just say, oh, we can't really affect this? I think the first premise of this kind of work is that we can make a difference. That we can compare different units, different officials, different ideas in relation to results, and treat the process of crime prevention no different from how we treat the winning of elections, the creation of public health, and the winning of baseball games, all of which is being driven by the triple T, or the triple E. Escoger, escuchar, examinar. It's how baseball teams win. It's how Obama won the election. Obama was targeted in a much more focused way than any president ever had before in running for office in the history of the United States. Far more than his opponent, Mr. Romney. Mr. Obama was targeting not only the states, not only the cities within the states, but individual voters with a massive computerized database, not only about who was supporting Obama to get them to vote, but who was sort of not sure. And can we come back to them and persuade them and make sure that they come to the polls and vote for Obama? And that required testing. Not only how you communicate, for example, knocking on the door, calling on the phone, or sending a letter. Controlled experiments showed the most effective way to reach voters, to get them to vote, is by knocking on the door and having a conversation. And what is this conversation about? Also a matter for testing. You could talk about the economy, you could talk about foreign policy, you could talk about women's issues. Obama knew from testing which message, which topic would be most persuasive to the voters, not just all over the country, but city by city and by different kinds of voters. This is the use of data to change human behavior. And the same principles that got Obama elected can reduce crime. Targeting in the U.S., as you know, depends on the fact that each state, even if 51% vote one way, 100% of the votes for the whole state go that way. So this map of the U.S., in a way, is like a map of crime in a city. So it tells you where to put the most effort. And it was the gray areas, not the red areas that were firmly Republican, not the blue areas that were firmly Democrat. There was nothing much that would change there, but the gray areas were the top priority. And I guarantee you, 80% of Obama's funding to win that election went to the gray areas. Now imagine those gray areas are high crime areas. Do we put 80% of our crime money in the critical crime areas? These are the kinds of questions that triple T or triple E can take us to. Just as the Oakland, California athletics baseball team in 2001, when it was at the bottom of the league, boy did they lose a lot of baseball games. They had very little money. They couldn't buy the best baseball players. So they started using a statistical algorithm, not only to identify good baseball players, but cost-effective baseball players. Baseball players who could get on first base and bat in the runs, who didn't get very much salary. And so in 1 year, according to this book, Moneyball, now made into a movie with Brad Pitt. Moneyball. Watch Moneyball. If you want to learn about what I'm saying this morning, just watch the movie. The movie will tell you that in 1 year they went from the bottom of the league to the top of the league. And they almost beat the New York Yankees by doing something no baseball team had ever done before, by trying to use statistics to target the most important question, which is who is going to play the baseball game. And by targeting the players who are good at getting on base, at runs batted in, and at low cost, they sadly made the talent scouts very angry, because the talent scouts were looking for what they thought was important, because they had a lot of experience. What did they think was important? That you had to look good as a baseball player. That you had to be graceful. You had to not look awkward. You couldn't be too heavy at the middle. You couldn't be too short. You shouldn't be seen to work too hard. What talent scouts like is the same thing that movie directors like. But you don't win baseball games like you make a picture or a successful movie. And everybody the statistician wanted to hire, the talent scout said, no, there's no good in hiring that person. And they were wrong. And that's why they were losing baseball games. So the toughest scene in this movie is when all of the talent scouts quit. And this is the cultural challenge in evidence-based baseball and evidence-based crime prevention. Do we give up what we think we know, but we never tested? If we do the test and we get the result that says, no, don't do it that way, do it this way, people will be angry. People can be upset. But if you make the change, you win the baseball game. You win the election. And you prevent crime. So, in security, what are our targets? Our targets are hotspots, places at hot times of day and of the day of the week. You know that. You probably do some of that. You also know about repeat offenders. You may not know about most dangerous offenders. Because this is relatively new, in which we distinguish between doing a lot of crimes and a lot of harm. Would you be more worried about somebody who's going to break into 50 automobiles, smash the window and take something, or one person who's going to hold up the grocery store and shoot the clerk? I would say there's more harm in shooting one clerk than in breaking into 50 cars. But our statistical models have not made that distinction. In corrections, in Britain, right now, the only question, the only statistic they use is whether there will be a conviction for any crime at all. Shoplifting, walking across the street illegally, spitting on the sidewalk. They make no distinction between murder and theft. So now that distinction is coming. And when we identify the most dangerous people, in probation in Philadelphia now, within 15 seconds, as soon as somebody is sentenced to community supervision, the probation department knows if they're very likely to kill somebody. And they will give them special treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy. to keep them from trying to kill somebody. They have 50,000 people on probation. They use this system for only 500, 1%. And that's the focus. That's the escoger. Now, we know about repeat victims. Again, some are more likely to suffer serious harm. You know about fences who receive stolen goods. But what about recruiters? What about people who are constantly introducing innocent young people with no prior criminal record? Their first crime is committed with this older offender who teaches them how to do crime. This phenomenon has just been identified in Sacramento, California, far more precisely than ever before. And in Sacramento, they now know that 1/3 of all the robberies in Sacramento are committed by people who were brought into crime by an older recruiter, almost like a baseball talent scout. You look like a good, dangerous person. Let me show you how to hurt people, how to shoot people, how to steal from people. Who do I want to target? Number one, the most harmful people to get off the street and to put behind bars are the crime recruiters. And the way to find them out is to link the arrest record for each crime to the co-arrestees, the other people who were arrested in relation to that one crime. And then you rank all of the offenders you know by a simple number. How many people have they ever been arrested with? Unique, different individuals. How many have they been arrested with? And the more people they've been arrested with, the more likely they are to be recruiters. You can double check to see how many people they have been arrested with who never had a prior arrest before that one. And this idea of the recruiter could transform policing and corrections, because we would have a whole new focus on crime as an infectious disease. Crime as an infectious disease can draw on public health principles of how you control infection, how you try to minimize the contact between these recruiters and other people. The hotspots of crime allow you to ask the question of whether some hotspots are hotter than others, whether you're giving them all equal attention, or perhaps giving more to some than others. Targeting the most dangerous people in Philadelphia now, using this complex equation, we can identify 2%.